They thought stripping me of my CEO title, freezing my bank accounts, and kicking me out of the mansion I designed marked the end of my life. But they forgot one basic thing. I was not just the wife who built that empire. I was the keeper of every password, every legal loophole, and the dark secrets they believed were buried. When my cousin walked down the aisle in white, I triggered the time bomb I had set long ago. My name is Elena. I stood before the grand oak doors of the hillside mansion in Seattle that I had designed myself, my body aching from a grueling 14-hour flight from Berlin. I had just spent 3 weeks salvaging a catastrophic supply chain crisis for Omniflow Logistics across 5 European countries, sleeping less than 4 hours a night to save the company from bankruptcy. All I wanted was a hot shower, a glass of wine with my husband, and the comfort of my own bed. However, as I pulled into the driveway, I noticed the house was blazing with light. It was 1 in the morning, yet every chandelier on the first floor was illuminated. I pushed open the doors and walked into the living room, dropping my suitcase on the marble floor. The silence was heavy and suffocating. They were all there. My husband Gavin, my mother Margaret, my 20-year-old son Leo, and my cousin Vanessa. They sat arranged on the velvet sofas in a semicircle, staring at me like a panel of judges waiting for a defendant to take the stand. Gavin did not stand up to greet me. He looked at me with a chilling detachment that sent a shiver down my spine. He told me to sit down because he had an announcement. Without a hint of remorse, he stated that our marriage was over. He spoke the words as if he were reading a quarterly report. He told me he had finally found true love, someone who understood his soul and did not treat him like a subordinate. He reached out and took Vanessa's hand. He said Vanessa understood him in ways I never could. I looked desperately at my mother, waiting for her to scream at him for his infidelity, but she just pursed her lips in disapproval. She looked at me. She told me this was entirely my fault. She said I was a dry, emotionless wife who cared more about shipping containers and profit margins than my husband's heart. She actually told me to be an adult and accept this for the sake of family happiness because Vanessa made Gavin happy. She suggested I should step aside gracefully. That was when I saw it. The glitter around Vanessa's neck caught the light. It was my grandmother's diamond necklace, a priceless heirloom I thought I had lost 6 months ago. Vanessa saw me staring and touched the stones with a self-satisfied smirk. She admitted she had found it in my vanity drawer during one of the many nights she spent in my bed while I was working late at the office. She told me they had been together for 2 years right under my nose, living a life in my house while I was out earning the money to pay for it. I lunged forward, blinded by a mixture of rage and nausea, intending to slap the smirk off her face, but a strong hand shoved me back hard. It was Leo. My own son stood between me and his father, his chest heaving. He looked down at me with a sneer I did not recognize and called me a control freak and a dictator. He said he was done living by my strict rules and academic expectations. He told me he was standing with his father because Gavin had promised him the position of marketing director at the company immediately. My 20-year-old son, who had barely passed his college midterms, was selling his mother out for a job title he was not qualified to hold. Gavin tossed a stack of legal documents onto the coffee table. He demanded I sign the divorce papers immediately, right there and then. I scanned the first page and saw the terms were absolute robbery, stripping me of my equity and rights. I refused and threw the pen on the floor. Gavin laughed and checked his watch. He told me it did not matter if I signed or not because he had already leveraged his power of attorney to freeze my bank accounts and revoke my security clearance at Omniflow. Before I could process the scale of the coup, 2 private security guards I did not recognize marched into the room. They grabbed my arms with bruising force. I screamed at my mother to do something, but she just turned her head away and poured herself a cup of tea as if I were a stranger causing a scene. The guards dragged me out the front door and threw me onto the wet pavement. The freezing Seattle rain soaked through my blouse instantly. I sat there in the mud, shivering and alone, clutching the strap of my carry-on bag which held the only thing they had let me keep, my laptop. I drove through the rain for hours with no destination in mind, my hands gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. The gas light on the dashboard blinked an angry orange warning, forcing me to pull into a desolate service station off the interstate. I slid my Platinum credit card into the reader, but the screen flashed a red error message. I tried my debit card next, then my emergency backup card. Declined. 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 A wave of nausea washed over me as I realized the depth of Gavin's betrayal. He had not just decided to leave me tonight. He had been moving assets and isolating accounts for months, waiting for the perfect moment to cut the financial cord. I was a CEO with zero access to the fortune I had earned. I dug through my purse and found $300 in crumpled bills, the only lifeline I had left. I drove another 10 miles until I found a motel with flickering neon signage that promised low rates. The lobby smelled of stale cigarettes and industrial cleaner. I paid cash for a room on the second floor. When I unlocked the door, the air was thick with the scent of mold and despair. The carpet was sticky, and the sheets looked gray under the harsh fluorescent light. I sat on the edge of the sagging mattress, clutching my laptop like a shield. I opened the computer, hoping to contact my assistant, but a notification popped up on the screen. It was an email from the head of human resources, a woman I had personally mentored and promoted 3 times. The subject line read, "Termination of contract." The body of the email was brief and brutal. I was being fired effective immediately for allegedly leaking trade secrets to competitors. It was a complete fabrication, a lie so bold it left me breathless. Gavin had not just taken my marriage, he was systematically destroying my professional reputation to ensure I could never fight back. My hands shook as I dialed the numbers of my closest friends, people I had known for 20 years. The first call went straight to voicemail. The second was answered, but the tone was pitying and distant. My friend Sarah told me that Gavin had called everyone to explain that I was suffering from a severe nervous breakdown and was prone to paranoid delusions. She told me to get help and then hung up. He had poisoned the well before I even knew I was thirsty. My phone buzzed again, and my heart leaped, thinking perhaps Leo had come to his senses. I opened the message. It was from my son, but there was no apology. He told me to stop causing drama and not to freeze any more assets because his father had promised to take him to the dealership tomorrow to order his custom sports car. He ended the text by saying I was being selfish. I stared at the glowing screen until the tears finally stopped coming. I lay back in the darkness, listening to the sound of trucks rumbling past on the highway. Memories of my childhood flooded back, clarifying the grim reality of my life. My father died when I was young, and from that moment on, I had to be the strong one. I worked double shifts, studied until dawn, and built a career to earn a shred of approval from my mother, Margaret. But it was never enough. When my aunt died, Vanessa came to live with us. Vanessa, the poor orphan, the fragile beauty who needed protection. My mother coddled her, gave her everything I worked for, and told me to be understanding. The truth hit me harder than the cold rain outside. I had never been the beloved daughter or the cherished wife. I was the pack mule. I was the engine that powered their lavish lifestyles, the beast of burden they tolerated as long as the checks cleared. Now that they had stolen the keys to the engine, they had discarded the mule. I eventually fell into a fitful sleep. When I woke up, the sun was slicing through the thin curtains. I waited for the grief to crush me again, but it was gone. In its place was a cold, hard emptiness. I sat up and walked to the bathroom mirror. The woman staring back was not a victim. I was a logistician. I spent my life fixing broken systems and rooting around obstacles. My family was no longer a family. They were a supply chain disruption, and I knew exactly how to handle inefficiencies. I washed my face with cold water, opened my laptop, and began to work. I sat at the wobbly laminate desk in the motel room and plugged a small encrypted USB drive into my laptop. Gavin thought that revoking my company credentials and freezing my access cards was a checkmate. But he failed to remember that I was the one who architected the entire digital infrastructure of OmniFlow Logistics. I did not need a password to enter a house I had built. I just needed the spare key I had hidden under the digital doormat years ago. I booted the system using a separate operating system contained on the drive, bypassed the corporate firewall, and slipped through a back door in the server code that no one else knew existed. Within 10 minutes, I was inside the mainframe. I did not look at the surface-level accounts, which I knew Gavin would have scrubbed clean. Instead, I dove into the raw transaction logs and the shadow archives. The pattern emerged almost immediately. It was not just infidelity, it was systematic corporate theft. I found a series of substantial payments going to 3 different shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands. The director of all 3 was listed as Vanessa. My cousin was not a criminal mastermind. She was lazy and intellectually sloppy, leaving a digital trail so wide a blind man could follow it. She had been charging personal expenses to the company under the guise of client acquisition costs. I saw invoices for a first-class trip to the Maldives listed as site inspection, and a receipt for a $40,000 shopping spree at a luxury boutique in Paris categorized as office supplies. She was treating the company operating budget like her personal piggy bank, and Gavin was approving every single transaction. As I dug deeper, the crimes shifted from embezzlement to federal felonies. I uncovered a folder of customs declarations that had been altered. Gavin was importing substandard electronic components from a blacklisted supplier in Asia and relabeling them as high-grade certified parts to slash production costs. The terrifying part was not the fraud itself, but the signature at the bottom of the approval forms. It was my digital signature. Gavin had stolen my encryption key and was authorizing these illegal shipments in my name. He was setting me up to take the fall for federal smuggling charges while he walked away with the profit. I then found the motivation for their urgency. In a folder marked Future Strategy, I found detailed plans for what they called the Wedding of the Century. It was scheduled for next month. They were planning a lavish ceremony not out of love, but as a massive public relations stunt to attract new investors. The company was hemorrhaging cash due to their theft, and they needed an influx of capital to cover the holes before the auditors arrived. The wedding was their cover story to legitimize their union and secure the funding they needed to survive. My fingers flew across the keyboard, searching for one last piece of the puzzle. I searched for my mother's name in the payroll ledger. There it was. For the past 2 years, Margaret had been receiving a monthly transfer of $5,000 labeled as consulting fees. My own mother had not just betrayed me emotionally, she was on the payroll. That money was the price of her silence and her loyalty. She had sold her daughter for a monthly stipend. I accessed the internal chat logs next. Reading their messages was an exercise in masochism, but I needed the data. I archived thousands of texts between Gavin, Vanessa, and my mother. They mocked my work ethic, laughed about how easy it was to deceive me, and joked about spending my money. I backed up every single byte of data, every forged invoice, and every incriminating message to 3 separate cloud servers and the physical drive in my hand. My instinct was to call the police immediately, but I stopped myself. Gavin was arrogant, but he was also prepared. He had the family lawyer, a man I had trusted for a decade, completely in his pocket. If I went to the authorities now with a public defender, Gavin's legal team would bury me in motions and claim I fabricated the evidence after being fired. I could not fight this battle with the truth alone. I needed leverage. I needed a weapon that Gavin feared more than the law. I needed a predator who was bigger and hungrier than he was. I closed my laptop and stared at the wall. I knew exactly who I had to call. I knew I could not win a fair fight, so I decided to start an unfair one. I reached out to Marcus Vane, the CEO of Vane Global and the indisputable shark of the logistics industry. He was a man known for his ruthlessness in the boardroom, but he also possessed a rigid code of honor that my husband lacked entirely. I arranged a meeting at a dimly lit, underground speakeasy in the Pioneer Square district, a place where the music was low and the privacy was absolute. When I slid into the booth opposite him, Marcus looked at me with mild amusement, likely expecting a plea for a job. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I looked him in the eye and told him that I could hand him OmniFlow logistics for pennies on the dollar. But the price for that opportunity was his protection and the full force of his legal team. Marcus chuckled and reached for his drink, dismissing me as a scorned ex-wife making empty threats. That was when I slid the black folder across the mahogany table. He opened it, and his smile vanished instantly. As he flipped through the pages detailing the customs fraud, the fake invoices, and the shell companies, his expression shifted from skepticism to predatory focus. He realized what I was offering him. It was not just a company, it was a loaded gun pointed at his biggest competitor. He looked up at me and asked what I wanted. I told him I wanted to destroy them, and I needed the resources to do it properly. He extended his hand, and we shook on the devil's bargain. By the next afternoon, I had moved out of the motel and into a serviced luxury apartment in downtown Seattle, paid for by Vane Global. With financial security and a team of sharks behind me, I began my transformation. I cut my hair into a sharp, angular bob and traded my sensible, worn-out suits for tailored architectural pieces that screamed power. The tired, weeping woman who had been thrown out in the rain was dead. My new legal team, funded by Marcus, drafted a divorce settlement that looked like a total capitulation. On the surface, it gave Gavin everything. I waived my right to alimony. I surrendered my shares in the company, and I gave up any claim to the marital home. To Gavin and his arrogant lawyer, it looked like I was simply rolling over to die. However, buried deep within the dense legal text on page 42, Section 8, Clause 3, was a provision we had carefully engineered. It stated that by accepting full ownership of the company assets, the retaining party also assumed sole and retroactive personal liability for all corporate governance and financial discrepancies occurring in the previous 5 years. The meeting to sign the papers took place in the OmniFlow conference room. Gavin sat there, practically glowing with arrogance, flanked by Vanessa, who was busy looking at wedding venues on her tablet. His lawyer, a man who had clearly underestimated me, skimmed the document and told Gavin it was a complete victory. They were so blinded by greed and the prospect of getting rid of me that they did not read the fine print. Gavin signed his name with a flourish, effectively signing his own death warrant. As he capped his pen, Gavin looked at me with a sneer. He told me he was glad I had finally accepted my defeat. Then, with a cruel glint in his eye, he invited me to their wedding next month. He said I should come and see what a successful partnership actually looked like. I looked him dead in the eyes and smiled, a genuine, terrifying smile. I told him I would be delighted to attend. From that moment on, I went on the offensive in the shadows. I used my old industry contacts to whisper rumors that OmniFlow was on the verge of announcing record-breaking profits and a massive merger. The lie spread like wildfire. Believing his own hype and thinking the company was untouchable, Gavin began to hemorrhage money. He doubled the budget for the wedding, ordering exotic flowers from Holland and booking a Michelin star chef, convinced that he was the king of the world. He had no idea he was just fattening himself up for the slaughter. I sat at a secluded table outside a coffee shop near the university campus, my hands trembling slightly as they rested on a thick manila envelope. This was not a business meeting or a strategic maneuver. It was a desperate rescue mission. I had sent a text to my son Leo earlier that morning, begging him for just 10 minutes of his time. I needed to look him in the eye one last time before the storm hit. I needed to offer him a lifeboat before I sank the ship he was so eager to captain. I heard him before I saw him. The aggressive roar of a high-performance engine shattered the quiet morning air. A brand new, bright red sports car screeched to a halt at the curb, illegally parking in a loading zone. It was a vehicle that cost more than $100,000, paid for with funds that should have gone to employee pensions. Leo stepped out of the car wearing designer sunglasses and a suit that was too expensive for a college student. He tossed the keys to a valet who was not even on duty, assuming someone would just handle it for him. My heart sank. He walked with a swagger that was a terrifying replica of his father. He sat down opposite me and did not remove his sunglasses. He checked his watch ostentatiously and told me to make it quick because he had a tuxedo fitting in 45 minutes. I swallowed the lump in my throat and slid the envelope across the metal table. I told him that he needed to look at the papers inside. I explained that they were the real financial reports of Omniflow, not the doctored ones Gavin showed the board. I told him the company was drowning in debt and that the liquidity was an illusion. I pleaded with him to decline the marketing director position, to go back to his classes, and to finish his degree. I warned him that if he tied his name to the company now, his future would be destroyed when the truth came out. Leo did not even open the envelope. He laughed, a harsh and cruel sound that drew stares from other patrons. He stood up and swept the papers off the table, scattering my evidence onto the dirty pavement. He looked down at me with pure contempt and told me that I was pathetic. He called me a bitter loser who was consumed by jealousy because Dad was winning. He declared that he was the heir to the empire and that he did not need life advice from a woman who couldn't even keep her job. He told me to stay out of his way. I watched my son walk back to the car that was bought with stolen money. He revved the engine loudly and sped away, leaving tire marks on the road. The pain was physical, a sharp ache in the center of my chest. I realized then that the sweet boy I had raised, the one who used to bring me wildflowers, was gone. He had been completely corrupted by the toxic indulgence of his father and grandmother. They had taught him that money was a substitute for character. I sat there for a long time, the cold coffee untouched in front of me. Then, I took out my phone. For years, I had been paying for Leo's car insurance, his health coverage, and the credit card he used for his lifestyle. Even after Gavin froze my main accounts, I had continued to pay these bills from a small personal savings account I had set aside for emergencies. I dialed the insurance company first. I spoke clearly and told them to cancel the policy effective immediately. Then I called the bank and reported the credit card as no longer authorized. If he wanted to be a man of the world, he would have to survive the reality of it. Just as I lowered the phone, it rang again. The caller ID showed my mother's name. I answered, hoping for a shred of maternal kindness, perhaps a check-in after the brutality of the last few weeks. Instead, Margaret's voice was sharp and critical. She did not ask how I was. She simply told me that if I intended to show my face at the wedding, I had better dress appropriately. She said she did not want me looking like a beggar and embarrassing the family on their big day. The final thread of attachment snapped. The grief vanished, replaced by a glacier of resolve. I gripped the phone tight and replied with a voice so calm it frightened me. I told her to rest assured. I told her I would be there, and I would be bringing a gift that she would remember for the rest of her life. I hung up before she could say another word. The time for tears was over. The final week before the wedding was not spent in mourning. It was spent in the cold, methodical preparation of an execution. The rhythm of my days accelerated into a blur of adrenaline and calculated risk. I worked closely with Marcus Vane to assemble a roster of human weapons to complement my digital evidence. We tracked down Sarah, the former executive assistant whom Vanessa had fired 3 months ago for the crime of buying the wrong brand of sparkling water. Sarah was unemployed and furious, and when we sat her down, she poured out details about the off-the-books cash transfers Vanessa had forced her to facilitate. We had our witness. Next came the stage. The wedding was set to take place at the Grand Azure, a 5-star resort perched on the cliffs overlooking the ocean. I did not need a physical key to get in. I needed digital dominance. I drove to the hotel parking lot at 2 a.m, sitting in my car with my laptop as I scanned for their internal network. Their security was laughable. Within 20 minutes, I had bypassed the firewall and gained administrator access to the ballroom's audio-visual system. I planted a dormant script in their server that would allow me to hijack the projector and sound system with a single keystroke from my phone. I knew I had to bait the trap to ensure maximum humiliation, so I sent a package to the mansion addressed to Vanessa. Inside was a velvet box containing a necklace and earring set that glittered with blinding intensity. To the untrained eye, it looked like a platinum set worth $200,000. In reality, It was high-grade stage jewelry I had purchased for $300. I included a typed note from an anonymous admirer praising her beauty. I knew Vanessa's vanity was her greatest weakness. She would not question the source. She would simply assume the universe was finally acknowledging her brilliance. She would wear the fake jewels, and they would become the noose around her neck. Gavin, however, was beginning to sweat. My backdoor access into his emails revealed that he was panicking because 2 massive shipping containers had been flagged and held by customs agents at the port. He was terrified that the authorities were onto his smuggling operation. I could not let him cancel the wedding or flee before the trap was sprung. So I intervened. Using a burner email address and spoofing the identity of a senior customs broker, I sent him a message explaining that the hold was merely a random administrative audit caused by a computer glitch and would be resolved in 48 hours. I watched the read receipt turn blue. He believed it because he was desperate to believe that nothing could ruin his coronation. I then turned my attention to my own armor. I refused to show up as the grieving ex-wife in a somber black dress. I went to a high-end tailor and commissioned a suit that defied all social etiquette. It was a tuxedo cut for a woman, sharp as a razor blade, and it was pure, blinding white. It was a deliberate insult to the bride and a declaration of war. I was not there to fade into the background. I was there to shine brighter than the sun. 2 days before the ceremony, I met Marcus in his office to finalize the operation we called the Net. We reviewed the guest list one last time. The governor would be there. 3 major venture capital firms would be present. The press would be out in full force. We confirmed that the economic police and the federal agents would wait in the service corridor until my signal. Marcus looked at me with a rare expression of respect and asked if I was ready to burn it all down. I told him I had already struck the match. The night before the wedding, I sat alone in my apartment in front of the fireplace. I held a stack of photographs in my hands. There was a picture of Gavin and me in Paris, a photo of Leo's first birthday, and a snapshot of my mother hugging me at graduation. I looked at them for a long time, searching for any lingering affection, but I found nothing. I tossed them into the fire one by one. As the edges curled and turned to ash, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. The Elena who desperately sought their love was dead. Just as the last photo crumbled into embers, my phone buzzed on the coffee table. It was a text from Gavin. He wrote to tell me not to be late because he wanted me to witness what real happiness looked like. I stared at the screen and felt a cold smile spread across my face. He had no idea that he was not the writer of this story anymore. I was. The ceremony was a masterclass in vulgarity. It was held in the grand ballroom of the resort, a space decked out with enough white lilies to bury a small country. 500 guests filled the gold Chiavari chairs, a mix of Seattle's social elite, unsuspecting investors, and hungry members of the press that Gavin had invited to document his triumph. The air smelled of expensive perfume and heavy hypocrisy. I watched from the shadows of the vestibule for a moment before making my move, observing the circus my money had paid for. My mother, Margaret, was in her element. She was wearing a sequined gold gown that was far too young for her and far too loud for the occasion. She fluttered between the guests like a hummingbird, clutching a glass of champagne and boasting loudly about her brilliant son-in-law and her niece, whom she described as a woman of beauty and talent. I listened as she erased me from the family history, telling a senator's wife that Vanessa had always been Gavin's true intellectual match. She did not mention my name once. To her, I was already a ghost. Then the music swelled, and Vanessa appeared at the top of the aisle. She looked triumphant. She walked with her chin held high, convinced she had won the lottery of life. Around her neck, the fake diamond necklace I had sent her caught the glare of the camera flashes, sparkling with a brilliance that matched her artificial smile. She touched the stones repeatedly, preening for the audience, completely unaware that she was wearing costume jewelry worth less than the catering bill for one table. It was a perfect metaphor for her life shiny, hollow, and fundamentally worthless. She reached the altar where Gavin was waiting. He looked handsome in his bespoke tuxedo, but his demeanor was all wrong. As the officiant began to speak, Gavin kept glancing down at his palm. He was not reading vows, he was checking his phone, likely looking for an update on the shipping containers I had manipulated. He recited his vows about eternal love, honesty, and transparency in a monotone voice, his eyes darting back to the screen every few seconds. It was a performance so transparently fake, it was almost comedic. Standing beside him as the best man was my son, Leo. He was already swaying slightly, his face flushed from consuming too much vintage champagne before the ceremony even started. He smirked at the bridesmaids and basked in the attention, clearly loving his new role as the Dauphin of a criminal empire. He looked at his father with hero worship, blind to the fact that the man next to him was about to drag him off a cliff. The officiant asked for the rings. That was my cue. The heavy double doors at the back of the room swung open with a loud thud that echoed through the silent hall. Every head turned. I stood there framed by the afternoon light, not in a black dress of mourning, but in a razor-sharp white tuxedo that fit me like a second skin. It was a power move, a visual declaration that I was the alpha in the room. A murmur of shock rippled through the crowd. I saw the blood drain from Gavin's face. Vanessa dropped her bouquet. I began to walk down the center aisle. My heels clicked rhythmically on the marble floor, the only sound in the room besides the gasps of the guests. 2 large security guards started to move toward me, their hands reaching for my arms to escort me out. They never made it. From behind me, Marcus Vane stepped into the light, followed immediately by 4 of his elite private security contractors, men who looked formidable enough to stop a tank. Marcus simply held up a hand, and the wedding security guards froze, recognizing a power that outweighed their pay grade. They stepped back, lowering their heads. I walked past them, my gaze fixed solely on the stage. I did not look at the guests. I did not look at my mother, whose mouth was hanging open in horror. I walked straight up the steps to the altar. Gavin looked like he was about to vomit. Vanessa was trembling, clutching Gavin's arm. I stopped directly in front of the microphone stand. I did not scream. I did not cry. I looked at the terrified couple and then out at the sea of stunned faces. I smiled. A cool, professional smile that I used to reserve for boardroom takeovers. I reached out and adjusted the microphone. I told them to please continue. I announced that I was not there to stop the wedding. I said I was simply there to deliver a very special toast to the happy couple and to ensure that everyone present witnessed the truth behind their success. I turned to the projectionist booth, where my exploit was already running, and gave a small nod. The show was about to begin. I gripped the microphone stand with a steady hand. My voice amplified across the silent ballroom. It was calm, terrifyingly level, and devoid of any tremble. I looked directly at the crowd and announced that I had prepared a special multimedia tribute for the perfect couple, a compilation of moments that truly defined their relationship. Gavin looked confused for a split second, but before he could signal the technical booth to cut the feed, I pressed the enter key on my phone. The massive LED screen behind the altar, which was supposed to display a montage of romantic engagement photos, flickered and turned a harsh, bright white. A collective gasp ripped through the room as the first slide appeared. It was not a picture of a kiss. It was a high-resolution scan of a bank transfer. The text on the screen was 10 feet tall. It showed a transfer of $50,000 from the OmniFlow operating account to a shell company registered to Vanessa. Then came another slide, and another, monthly transfers to my mother, Margaret, labeled as consulting fees, totaling over $100,000 in 2 years. The audience began to murmur, the sound swelling like a rising tide. Then came the audio. My voice over the speakers was replaced by a recording I had captured from the server logs. It was a phone call between Gavin and Vanessa from 3 months ago. Their voices boomed through the ballroom with crystal clarity. The guests heard Gavin laughing about how easy it was to fool me, calling me a blind workhorse who would never suspect a thing. They heard Vanessa giggle and ask if they could use the tax evasion money to upgrade their suite for the honeymoon. The cruelty and the criminality were laid bare for 500 witnesses. The atmosphere in the room shifted from confusion to hostility in an instant. The investors in the front row, men and women who had put millions into the company, stood up and began to shout, demanding explanations. The flashbulbs from the press pit exploded into a strobe light effect, capturing every second of Gavin's disintegration. I clicked the button again. A new slide appeared, displaying a side-by-side comparison. On the left was a photo of the necklace Vanessa was currently wearing. On the right was the invoice I had generated for the purchase of high-quality stage props. The text read, "Costume jewelry, value $300. Beneath it was a second invoice showing that the platinum wedding bands Gavin was about to place on her finger had been purchased using the emergency payroll fund meant for our warehouse workers. The room erupted in jeers. Vanessa looked down at the necklace, her face turning a sickly shade of green as she realized she was wearing glass, not diamonds. Gavin snapped. With a roar of primal rage, he lunged across the altar, his hands reaching for the microphone to silence me. He never made it. Marcus Vane moved with the speed of a linebacker, stepping between us and shoving Gavin back with a single powerful thrust to the chest. Gavin stumbled and fell onto the steps of the altar, his expensive tuxedo rumpling as he hit the floor. I did not flinch. I looked down at him and delivered the final strike. I told the audience to look at the screen one last time. The final slide displayed the customs documents for the smuggled electronics. It showed my digital signature at the bottom, but next to it, in bright red text, was the IP address of the computer that had authorized the transaction. I explained that while the signature was mine, the location stamp proved the approval came from a device in this very hotel. 2 days after I had been fired and locked out of the system, I announced that I had been in a lawyer's office across town at that exact minute, providing me with an ironclad alibi. The realization that the game was over hit Vanessa like a physical blow. She looked at the angry crowd, then at the police officers closing in, and finally at Gavin on the floor. Panic overrode any loyalty she ever had. She screamed out loud, her voice shrill and hysterical. She pointed a trembling finger at Gavin and yelled that it was all his idea. She shouted that he had forced her to sign the papers and that she knew nothing about the smuggling. She claimed she was a victim. It was a scene of absolute chaos and humiliation. The bride and groom were turning on each other before the vows were even dry. I stood in the center of the storm in my white suit, untouched and vindicated, watching the house of cards collapse exactly as I had planned. The illusion of their victory shattered the moment the heavy doors burst open for the second time. This time, it was not a dramatic entrance for a speech. It was a raid. A squad of federal agents and economic crime officers swarmed the ballroom with practiced efficiency. They did not look at the flowers or the guests. They moved in a phalanx directly toward the altar. The lead agent stepped in front of Gavin, who was still trying to scramble to his feet. He flashed a badge and read the charges in a loud, authoritative voice that carried over the murmurs of the crowd. Commercial fraud, tax evasion, money laundering, racketeering. Gavin tried to stammer a denial, but the agent spun him around and slammed him against the marble altar. The sound of metal handcuffs ratcheting shut was the only music left in the room. Beside him, Vanessa tried to slip away into the crowd of bridesmaids, but 2 female officers intercepted her. She shrieked as they pulled her hands behind her back. The officer informed her that as the registered owner of the shell companies used to launder the stolen funds, she was being charged with conspiracy and possession of criminal assets. The fake diamond necklace she wore clattered against her collarbone as she struggled, a cheap accessory to a cheap crime. My mother, Margaret, broke through the cordon of stunned guests. Tears streamed down her face, ruining her heavy makeup. She ran to me, grabbing my arm with a desperation I had never seen before. She begged me to stop this. She pleaded with me to tell the officers it was a misunderstanding and to save her family. I looked at her hands clutching my white suit and felt nothing but repulsion. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a folded copy of a bank statement. I held it up for her to see. It highlighted the monthly payments she had received from the stolen funds. I told her that if she said one more word to me, I would hand this document to the FBI agent standing 5 feet away and have her charged as an accessory to the fraud. Her mouth snapped shut. She released my arm and stepped back, terrified by the realization that her own greed had left her vulnerable. I turned my gaze to Leo. My son stood frozen near the best man's spot, his face pale. A police officer approached him and held out a hand. He demanded the keys to the sports car parked out front, informing Leo that the vehicle was purchased with illicit funds and was now government property. Leo looked at me, his eyes wide with shock, silently asking for help. Then the officer delivered the second blow, telling him that his personal bank accounts, which had received transfers from his father, were frozen pending a federal investigation. The arrogance was gone, replaced by the terrifying reality that he was penniless. As the agents began to march Gavin out of the ballroom, his tuxedo shirt was torn and his hair was wild. He saw me standing there, calm and untouched. He lunged toward me, straining against the grip of the agents, and screamed at the top of his lungs. He called me cruel and heartless. He asked how I could do this to them. I looked him dead in the eye and spoke clearly enough for the press to hear. I told him that I was simply taking back what was mine. The room cleared out rapidly after that. The guests, horrified by the scandal, fled the scene to avoid being associated with the criminals. The ballroom, once filled with the promise of a celebration, was left in ruins. Overturned chairs, spilled champagne, and the remnants of a wedding that never happened littered the floor. It was a graveyard of their ambition. Marcus Vane stepped up to the cluster of microphones that the press had set up near the exit. He seized the narrative immediately. He announced that Vane Global would be acquiring the assets of OmniFlow Logistics following the inevitable liquidation. He promised to retain the workforce and protect the pensions of the innocent employees, but he made it clear that the acquisition would exclude any members of the former executive family. He framed it as a rescue mission, positioning himself as the savior of the industry while effectively erasing Gavin's legacy from existence. I turned my back on the chaos and walked toward the terrace doors. I pushed them open and stepped out into the cool evening air. The sun was setting over the Pacific Ocean, painting the sky in shades of violet and gold. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the salty sea breeze. For the first time in months, the crushing weight on my chest was gone. The anger, the betrayal, and the exhausting need for justice had all evaporated, leaving behind a profound sense of peace. I was alone, but I was free. 6 months later, the gavel finally fell, sealing the fate of the people who tried to destroy me. Gavin was sentenced to 12 years in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of parole for the first 10. Vanessa, despite her weeping and attempts to play the victim, received 5 years in prison followed by 3 years of mandatory community service. The judge was particularly unimpressed by her attempt to flee the state during the trial. My mother, Margaret, suffered a quieter but equally devastating punishment. She had secretly mortgaged her own house to post bail for Vanessa, convinced that Gavin had a backup plan to get them out of the country. When their assets were seized and the flight risk was confirmed, the bail was forfeited. The bank took her home. She now lives in a small, subsidized apartment on the outskirts of the city. The relatives she used to brag to have completely ostracized her, unwilling to be associated with the scandal. She calls me occasionally, but I never answer. My son, Leo, faced the cold reality of the real world for the first time in his life. The university expelled him, citing the massive reputational damage caused by the federal investigation and the fact that his tuition checks had bounced. He is currently working as a waiter at a diner downtown, living in a shared room. He tried to come to my new office last week, likely hoping for a check or a car, but my executive assistant intercepted him at the lobby security desk. I did not go down to see him. Instead, I sent a courier to his work address with a thick envelope. Inside, there was no money. It contained a single application form for a trade school electrician program and a handwritten note. I simply wrote that he needed to learn to stand on his own 2 feet, just as I had done before his father corrupted him. It was the toughest love I could give, but it was the only thing that might save him. As for me, I did not return to OmniFlow. I launched my own firm, a boutique supply chain consultancy that operates entirely on my terms. I partner with Marcus Vane on major international contracts, but I retained 51% of the equity in my company. I answer to no one. I make my own schedule, and I choose my own battles. The final emotional knot was untied yesterday morning, when the bank foreclosed on my former marital home, the mansion I had designed with so much hope and naive love. It went up for public auction. I bought it back for a fraction of its original value. I did not buy it to live in it. I stood at the iron gates, watching the heavy machinery roll onto the lawn. I gave the signal to the foreman, and the diesel engines roared to life. The sound of the bulldozer tearing through the front facade, crushing the balcony where I used to drink coffee and wait for a husband who never came home, was the sweetest symphony I had ever heard. I watched the walls crumble, burying the memories of infidelity, gaslighting, and betrayal under tons of rubble and dust. I am not rebuilding a home there. I have already filed the permits to donate the land and construct a state-of-the-art training center for female entrepreneurs. It will be a place where women can learn to build empires that no man can ever take away from them. As the dust settled over the ruins, I walked back to my car. My phone rang. It was a new client from Tokyo, ready to sign a massive contract. I put on my sunglasses, smiled at the open road ahead, and answered the call. I put the car in drive and moved forward. Finally, the absolute captain of my own destiny. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I would love to know where you are tuning in from, so please drop a comment below to share your thoughts. Don't forget to subscribe to Lily Revenge Stories, like this video, and hit that hype button to help share this journey with others.